Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. This is Paul, and what I want to do in this video is talk about the claim there are no airtight arguments for God, or perhaps what is a fact. Now, you may be surprised to learn that I actually agree with this claim. I actually agree that there are no airtight arguments for God, and airtight in the sense that there's potentially no argument for God where everyone is going to believe in every single premise, and there's no possible alternative explanation for any of these other premises, that you just have to accept God exists. But I think this claim is often used in a very misleading and manipulative way. It's meant to sometimes mean more than it's meant to imply, and that's why I want to explore this claim. So while I may agree that there are no airtight arguments for God, I don't think what this is often meant to imply necessarily follows. In my own experience, when people make this claim, there are no airtight arguments for God, what they are communicating to me, what they mean to say, is, quote, I do not know much about epistemology, end quote. Epistemology being the study of knowledge. Now, of course, there may be people that use this claim who do know a lot about epistemology, but I'm just telling you this has been my experience that this has not been the case. So let's go ahead and look at how this claim is often used and why its usage in these contexts that I'm going to give you is completely wrong and misguided. So the claim is often used in an argument like this. Premise 1, there are no airtight arguments for the existence of God, or there is no airtight argument for the existence of God. You can, choose any one you want. I would agree with this premise. I would agree there's no airtight argument for the existence of God. We'll talk about other types of things that we may believe that there aren't airtight arguments for either. Premise 2, it is only reasonable to believe things that we have airtight arguments for. And the conclusion is, therefore, we should not believe in the existence of God. Now, this is an argument that I would totally disagree with. The problem I have with this argument isn't premise 1, it's premise 2. And this argument ends up having so many problems, it's hard to even know where to begin, but I'm going to start by talking about the 3 huge problems with this argument, especially when it's presented by somebody who's an atheist. Not necessarily an atheist. Not all atheists have a flawed epistemology like this, but some do, so that's what we're going to be talking about, those that do. So the first problem with this argument is it ends up debunking atheism, because we could replace atheism or God with atheism. We can say, premise 1, there are no airtight arguments for atheism, which is, I'm defining atheism as the belief that God does not exist, not as atheism is the lack of belief in God. I think that's a kind of a useless definition, to be totally honest. I'll make another video on that. But regardless, right, there's no airtight arguments for atheism. There could be a case that God does exist. It's not completely clear that God does not exist either. And as a result, if it's only reasonable to believe things we have airtight arguments for, we should not believe in atheism. We should not believe God does not exist. This isn't really a problem with the argument, but it is a problem for if the person giving this argument is an atheist who doesn't want to believe in God and wants to be rational, but still hold on to what I would argue is a flawed epistemology. So that's the first thing to notice. I guess if this is the epistemology that we want to use for premise 2, then of course we should be agnostic, not necessarily atheist either. The second problem with this argument is that premise 2 is actually pretty unreasonable to accept. We can replace God with just something else, like other minds, the external world, scientific results, the theory of evolution, these sorts of things. And we can basically say that, yeah, because we don't have airtight arguments for these particular things, we should not believe in them either because of premise 2. So, right, there's no airtight argument for belief in X. You can replace X with evolution. You can say, yeah, maybe young earth creationism is right. Maybe God created the world 6,000 years ago with the appearance of being 16 billion years old, and with the appearance that, evolution is true, and, maybe with some gaps in the fossil record, I don't know, but this is another possible explanation. And because this is another possible explanation, there's no airtight argument that evolution or naturalism is true, because here's an additional or alternative explanation for it. And if it's only reasonable to believe things that we have complete airtight arguments for, we should therefore not believe in whatever it is. And this gets to be really serious, because you can think, well, you don't know you're not in a dream or anything like that. I could be a figment of your imagination. You could be a brain in a vat. There are all these possible skeptical scenarios where you could be experiencing things that are not necessarily real. And therefore, if your standard of belief is only believing things you have airtight arguments for, there are lots of things you shouldn't believe. So at this point, I think there are 2 ways the skepticism can manifest. There's going to be what I call type 1 skepticism, which is to sort of bite the bullet and be a radical skeptic, or as C.S. Lewis would say, a more honorable skeptic. He calls some of David Hume's skepticism honorable skepticism, and I think that's because Lewis is noting that Hume is actually being consistent about his skepticism. Hume was skeptical about induction. He was like, how do I know the sun's going to rise tomorrow? Just because it's risen the last couple hundred days I've been alive, or maybe more than that, a couple thousand days I've been alive, doesn't necessarily mean I have an airtight argument that it's going to rise tomorrow, because this is based on induction. And of course, induction has led us to wrong results in the past. And if this is the case, right, if somebody wants to be a type 1 skeptic, then they can say, yeah, there are no airtight arguments for God, but this is kind of an uninteresting thing because they believe there are no airtight arguments for lots of other things in the world. So the question is, why single out God for this? And perhaps maybe I could see this being done in a way where the theist claims that they have an airtight argument for God, and the skeptic is going to claim, well, there are no airtight arguments for God. But if somebody wants to claim, well, I have an airtight argument that the external world exists or that evolution is true, then the type 1 skeptic, if they're going to be consistent, should also be really skeptical of those claims and be like, wait a minute, there's no airtight argument that evolution is true or that the external world exists. So why are they singling out belief in God? I don't know. Looks kind of like special pleading. The other type of skepticism is the sort of using premise 2 selectively, which this is actually special pleading, but not just, they're not actually being skeptical about other things, right? Why single out God as unreasonable if people believe in other things on the basis of evidence? So if somebody claims to be a skeptic and they have this really high evidential bar for belief in God, they need an airtight argument for the existence of God, but they believe other things like the external world existing, the theory of evolution being true, that other minds exist, these other sorts of things, they need to provide us a reason or a symmetry breaker why belief in God warrants such a high standard or burden of proof, or why this airtight argument is needed for God and not for anything else. And this is why I say when people use this sort of what I call type 2 skepticism, it looks to me like special pleading. Now, if there's somebody watching this video and you want to go in the comments and explain why you think belief in God should have a much higher standard of evidence, I'd be really curious to hear why, just simply because, and I'm not trying to be like a jerk here, I'm just literally trying to be honest and say, I just do not know what would be the reason if somebody does accept other things on the basis of not having airtight arguments for their basis of, there could be other things that explain it, why belief in God would necessarily need this. But I hope you could understand my skepticism of, well, why should we expect God to have this other standard or different type of burden of proof that we would have other things that we consider to potentially be rational to believe or that we believe. So that's particularly the case there. However, the biggest problem with this argument is that it's just completely self-defeating, and this is what probably led to the defeat of logical positivism, at least in part. We'll talk about that more later. Consider this argument. Premise 1, it is only reasonable to believe things that we have airtight arguments for. Now, this is premise 2 of the last argument, but I'm rearranging it for this one. Premise 2, there are no airtight arguments for belief in premise 1. Yeah, we could imagine that there are things that are reasonable to believe that we don't have airtight arguments for. And conclusion is, therefore, we should not believe in premise 1. Obviously, this argument is literally nonsense. It literally defeats itself. And that's because why should we accept premise 1? We don't have a sort of non-question begging, non-circular reason to accept premise 1. And if we do accept it, then what we're saying is it is reasonable to believe some things that we don't have airtight arguments for. So if we're going to single out premise 1 as an exception, then the theist is free to single out God as reasonable. Once again, this is going to sound ad hoc, but we'll talk about this more later, to say that, yeah, okay, you accept that there are some things that are reasonable to believe without any sort of airtight argument. There are plenty of other things that I can imagine are reasonable to believe. Let's just get rid of this whole idea of needing airtight arguments for reasonable belief. The claim that we need airtight arguments for a belief to be reasonable is not only self-defeating, but circular and question-begging because, once again, the sort of reasonability and airtightness of arguments presupposes reasonableness being related to arguments in the first place. So you're kind of assuming what you want to prove. So when we think about evidence for God, right, I would challenge the type 2 skeptic who thinks that belief in God is unreasonable to, once again, provide some sort of symmetry breaker for why belief in God is unreasonable, while other propositions, which I would point out we don't have any airtight arguments for, somehow are. And to that account, I would say, yeah, if you're a type 2 skeptic, give me 5 examples of beliefs that are not sort of trivial that we believe, that are reasonable to believe that we do have airtight arguments for. And these would be things that are not necessarily like trivially true. Like there are no square circles. Why? Because it would necessarily just lead to some sort of contradiction. Of course, that's true, but that's not really all that. It's like definitionally true. And I can give you one, right? I have a conscious experience. This is, well, I guess you could argue this is trivially true, but this is the one Descartes thought of. This is something he could be absolutely certain of, because if he wasn't having a conscious experience, he couldn't think the thought that he was having a conscious experience in the first place. But of course, you need to say the I part, because I, as in me, could be a figment of your imagination. So you don't technically have an airtight argument that I exist, I as in me. You would need to say that you have a conscious experience. So you would say, quote, I have a conscious experience. That's the really important part, right? You could be dreaming of me. I could be a figment of your imagination. You could be hallucinating me. So the thing is that you have a conscious experience. Lots of pronouns there. And even notice how even the claim there are no square circles isn't necessarily metaphysically impossible. We can imagine some sort of magical realm where there are circles with four corners, or we redefine one of these things to be the case. We don't necessarily know that it's not possible. It's not possible logically, but to claim that logical impossibility somehow implies metaphysically impossible, well, that's another claim. And if you're a skeptic, perhaps that's a claim you should be skeptical of. It's not one I'm skeptical of, but it's one the skeptic perhaps should be skeptical of. But it gets even worse than this, and let me explain why. The whole notion of reason or rationality is not really a concept that can be non-circularly justified. So any invocation of reason itself is not airtight by its own merits. And even worse, we don't really have an airtight definition of reason itself. But what this does do is exposes some of the flaws in evidentialism, which is the idea that all beliefs need to be founded on reasons. And this is why some people are foundationalists, why some people are coherentists. We'll talk about some of the problems with coherentism in a little bit. I won't go too far into it. But the main problem with evidentialism is you have this regress problem. You need reasons for those reasons and reasons for the reasons that you need reasons, and so on and so on and so on. So it just kind of ends up becoming a bit of a mess. So that's why a lot of people are foundationalists. You're saying, okay, we need some sort of ground truth, some things that are reasonable to believe, not necessarily on the basis of arguments, but perhaps on the basis of, let's say, sense experience or something like this. And from there, you can build up your other sort of tower of knowledge, and everything can be traced back to something that is either justified or reasonable to believe, not necessarily on its own merits. This is what Plantinga says in Warrant the Current Debate. He says, quote, "Indeed, this claim that proper belief in God requires propositional evidence is often put in terms of justification. In these contexts, justification and rationality are often used interchangeably," end quote. So once again, this relationship between justification and rationality, what these things actually mean, their relationship to truth, other things that the evidentialists will need to provide arguments and evidence for because of their own epistemology or by their own lights. And lastly, rationality is sort of an elusive term. One, I should note, we lack an airtight definition for. And if we're going to be claiming that the only things we should believe, if we're trying to make claims about rationality, we need to be really specific about what we mean by rationality. And then the question, how do we know this? Difficult questions, not easy questions to answer. So the problem here, I think, with airtight arguments is as follows. When we say airtight arguments, what really comes to mind is usually something like a syllogism, something like modus ponens, something like this. But how do we non-circularly justify that arguments or logic correspond to truth? This is no surprise to a lot of people, right? That logic can't prove itself. And you can imagine, Gödel's second incompleteness theorem, which shows any formal or axiomatic system cannot prove that the system itself is consistent. Of course, when we talk about logic, we tend to be talking about the axiomatic westernized type of logic. So assuming it is consistent, it can't prove that itself is consistent. So at some point, the explanation has to end somewhere, as Wittgenstein said. As a result, perhaps there are some things that are reasonable to believe, like logic, that you don't necessarily need an argument for. So this idea of needing airtight arguments for reasonable belief, I think, is just it's self-defeating, it's unreasonable. There are just a lot of reasons not to accept it. And this isn't just an abstract idea. This isn't just, of interest only to academic philosophers and logicians. This is a serious discussion when it comes to the connection between science, logic, and truth. So consider Quine, who says, quote, "Revision even of the logical law of the excluded middle has been proposed as a means of simplifying quantum mechanics," end quote. Very interesting point, right? That even our traditional ideas of logic are suspect given our empirical observations in some sort of conceptual scheme, given what we know about science, and this sort of almost tough relationship between science and logic is come under fire, at least recently, and potentially this might have led to some level of postmodernism, but that's a discussion for another day. So I think to a certain extent, some of this discussion is a little bit beside the point. One of the reasons that I say this is we tend to evaluate the rationality of most of our beliefs within some sort of conceptual scheme. And as Stephen Hawking, which despite some of my issues with some of his philosophical claims that I think are demonstrably false, has said, I do think he's right, or he hits the nail on the head when he says, look, there's no picture or theory independent concept of reality. And what I interpret him to mean by when he says this is really when we think of reality, it's always within some sort of conceptual or picture independent scheme. And I believe Thomas Kuhn would sort of agree with that. Perhaps Thomas Kuhn even influenced Hawking when he said this thing. So if your conceptual scheme is something like naturalism, some sort of scientific realism, or even atheism, perhaps the idea of God existing would seem like some sort of unnecessary hypothesis. And in a Bayesian way, conditioned on naturalism, why assume God exists? This would be some sort of unnecessary auxiliary hypothesis. The difficulty here is when we're having this conversation, we're asking a more fundamental question. How did we come to our conceptual scheme of naturalism or whatever, and is it justified? And one of the other questions we should ask is, does naturalism end up defeating itself if taken too far? Does naturalism end up undermining our reason for believing we have accurate cognitive faculties, including the ones that we have that led us to belief in naturalism itself? Kind of an interesting argument. Once again, made by a lot of different people, so don't want to take that too far. But these are kind of the questions that we're trying to explore here. And the other issue I want to say too is there are problems with just using coherence alone. So some people say, okay, the coherence within our conceptual scheme is fine because all we care about is the coherence of beliefs, not necessarily the objective truth or falsity of these beliefs. Or perhaps, and put another way, beliefs are justified based on their coherence or how well they fit into a conceptual scheme, not anything else. But as Plantinga argues, I think this was a good point. It's changed my view on this. Basically, if you're a coherentist, you're basically arguing circular reasoning is fine as long as the circles are larger. And I have an analogy that I use, maybe I'll do this in another video, of why I think coherentism fails in epistemology, because it doesn't actually explain how the arrangement of propositions relates to their justification or their truth. And that's one of the reasons I have difficulty accepting coherence. Don't get me wrong, I think coherence is a good way of evaluating whether our beliefs fit and what we need to pay attention to looking for evidence for. But I think alone, at just saying coherence is the only thing that provides justification ends up leading to some problems as well. So that's kind of something else. Once again, check out the book Warrant the Current Debate. Great book, pretty technical book, but worth your time reading to see some of this discussion as well. So, said a lot of stuff. What's kind of the point here? What's the conclusion? Well, one of the things to notice is that Reformed epistemology suggests belief in God can be rational, even if there are no arguments for the existence of God, whether some of those arguments are airtight or not. And just as kind of icing on the cake, the fact that there are arguments for the existence of God, and some in more recent years more compelling and creative than have ever been, just is more helpful, even if that's not necessarily what is needed. Now, I don't think Reformed epistemology is saying we should form our beliefs on the basis of no arguments or anything like that. I think it's just saying that taking this idea of evidentialism too far ends up defeating itself. So we need to be cautious about the claims we're making. We need to be cautious about the sort of superlative claims that we're making when it comes to the relationship between evidence and belief. And I think that is a fair point. We can trust logic. We can trust our sense faculties. I would argue we're justified in trusting these things, not necessarily on the basis of evidence, just because that is the way it is. And because there seems to be plenty of other beliefs we take to be rational that we do not form on the basis of arguments, including some of those that relates arguments in rationality to truth to avoid sort of circular reasoning, but also arguments about our own sense perception, about how we perceive the world. I believe it's rational or reasonable to believe that we experience the physical world the way it is, that we're not being tricked, these sorts of things. But we can only evaluate those things as rational if we don't also believe that it's unreasonable to believe things that we don't have airtight arguments for. So for more info, I would encourage you to look into the failure of positivism or logical positivism. It did fail in philosophy pretty hardcore, but many scientists, in the words of Einstein, who are poor philosophers, are kind of late to the party. So take a look at that. Very, very interesting historical reasons and what has come about from that. And then just some of the limits of evidentialism and the debate about warrant and internalism and externalism. There's lots of interesting arguments, especially following some of the papers that have gone on in the last 100 years on the internalism, externalism debate, which led to warrant and the debates around knowledge and things like that, like the Gettier problems. Really, really interesting and fun stuff, just for your intellectual stimulation. But anyway, thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any comments or questions. Be really interested to continuing the conversation, and hope you learned something. So I'll see you in the next video.